mentioned, CSS and JavaScript is a whole thing. If I Google that, CSS and JavaScript, I see, first of all, a couple of pieces of documentation. Then I see CSS and JavaScript, the future of component-based styling. Sounds like that's what we should be doing. All you need to know about CSS and JavaScript. Stop using CSS and JavaScript for web development. There are opinions about this thing. But if we look at either of these two, CSS and JavaScript, the future of component-based styling, or all you need to know about CSS and JavaScript, we'll see there are lots of ways of doing it. There's the way we did it, which is basically using inline styles. Then there's also styled components, Radium, Aphrodite. So there are several NPM packages for doing this thing. And what those do is instead of using inline styles, they actually make a style sheet using the style tag, using whatever you write. That way you can actually use things like the hover pseudo class or media queries for responsive design and all that stuff. Of those, I took a quick look. Aphrodite seems really easy to use. Again, this is not the point of the class, but I'm going to do it because I think it's interesting, and you can see it and you can take it or leave it. But I'll do it real quick because I do think it's cool. So Aphrodite is, like I said, an NPM package, so we need to actually install it. So if we just type yarn add Aphrodite or npm install Aphrodite, that does two things. It gets the Aphrodite package and places it in node modules. And just as importantly, it updates our package.json. So now our dependencies include Aphrodite. Since we don't actually commit our node modules folder, if someone else clones this project from GitHub and they run npm install, we need to make sure that they get Aphrodite because it won't run without it. So putting it in package.json ensures that they will. So let's read about it. Looks like this is a link. Let's click on Aphrodite. Works great with and without React. Supports media queries. Supports pseudo selectors like hover, active, etc. Good. Without having to store hover or active state in components. Good. Guess what that means? We don't need state anymore. So I'm going to turn it back into a stateless functional component. So I'm going to get rid of these two methods and my state. I'm going to change the class back into a function, const sidebar equals arrow function. I no longer need a render method, so I just get rid of this line, and I get rid of the corresponding curly brace. And I'm going to outdent all of this one level. I'll get rid of my on mouse enter, on mouse leave here. I don't know what I'm going to do about this opacity, but I don't need to do this. So I'll just change this back to this for now. Okay, back to doing this without the hover working. So let's see. Aphrodite. Installation, already did that. What we need to do, looks like we need to import two named exports from Aphrodite, style sheet and CSS. Okay, let's import those things. And I'm going to put them right under React before the line break because they are coming from an npm package. Also, important note, since we installed a new package, we actually need to restart our server. It won't necessarily pick up new stuff that's in the node modules folder. So Control-C your server and rerun yarn start, or it will not pick up that Aphrodite is there. Yep. Okay. Okay. So then our styles that we define down here, we do it the same way, except now we say stylesheet.create and pass that object into that. Here's my styles object. So now instead of just being this object, I say stylesheet.create that object, parentheses. And the way Aphrodite works and the reason it fixes some of our problems is instead of using inline styles, it actually puts a style tag in the header and puts some CSS in there. And it creates a class out of each of these things. And it's going to give them all unique names because, again, part of the purpose here is so that we don't accidentally style one component when we're trying to style another. So it's going to generate unique names for each style that we describe in here, unique class names. And then it's going to use those class names to apply these styles. So once we've done this, the only other thing we need to do to make this work is instead of saying style equals this, we actually set the class name. I don't need the class name of sidebar anymore because that's only there if I'm using the actual CSS. We don't need to target this. We're not using the DOM really. So I'll just get rid of that class name. And instead of saying style equals this, I say class name. And then I use this CSS function that we imported from Aphrodite. So if I say CSS and pass it my style, styles.sidebar, that CSS function is going to create that class for the style sheet. And then the CSS function will return that class name as a string, whatever class name it generates. So I'm going to go ahead and go through and do all of that. If you try to put class name in here twice, it's going to gripe at you. No duplicate props allowed. So I don't need the original class names. So class name equals CSS wrapped around styles.logo. Instead of style, I say CSS. I say class name equals the return value of calling this CSS function, which is imported from Aphrodite. Again, class name, CSS, parentheses, and I can get rid of the class name here. Class name, CSS. Get rid of this class name, CSS. Class name, CSS. Now the button, class name, CSS. Then our font awesome thing. This raises an interesting problem. So we have a style that we want to apply to it, but we actually need it to still have these classes. So what can we do? If we say class name, CSS, this, that's fine. We'll get whatever auto-generated class name it comes up with, but we really need those classes to be on there instead. So class name just expects a string, and CSS just returns a string. It's just an auto-generated string. So what we could do is inside the curly braces, put a template literal, use $ curly brace to insert that CSS function in there. And then just put FA dash sign out, space, CSS like that. So that just returns a string, the string FA space, FA sign out, space, whatever CSS returns. So I'll get all of those classes on there, which means it should look good. Okay, looks like I didn't screw anything up too bad. Now I still don't have my hover effect. We're getting there. But I didn't screw the whole thing up. Now for some of these where class name is the only prop, I don't necessarily need to put these on multiple lines. You can if you want to. but I think it's actually making it harder to read at this point. So for these where that's the only prop, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my line breaks. Make sure I didn't break it just now. I didn't. All right, so about hover. Well, first of all, let's look at how this actually is different in practice. So before, you remember, if I inspected this, I saw that it actually had the style attribute on the HTML element. If I look now, I see it has a class of new note img underscore and then some made up string. And if I look at the head of the document, I see a style tag with actual CSS in there. Actually, a bunch of style tags. These are not from that. Here's the, well, I think that's the one. If you look at any of these, you'll see the styles come from a class. Specifically from this one. So I claim you can do hover and stuff now. Totally can. You just use a key of :hover before some rules. So I have new note img that applies to both images. Now I'll make a separate style for new note img hover. And in there I will put a key of :hover, which is the hover pseudo class. And inside there I'll put whatever I want the style to be for hovering over it. So I'll put opacity 0. Put some commas in there. So now I want the second image to have this rule, this style as well as this one. So let's find it. Here's the second one. So the CSS function can take more than one style as an argument, and it will just, you don't have to worry about merging those two objects yourself. It'll do it. So styles dot new note image hover, and it'll do the right thing. And it works. Questions? So that's Aphrodite for doing CSS and JavaScript. Just an interesting little sidebar if you're interested in it. So style sidebar using Aphrodite.